The research worker you see here is just about ready to chuck it all and go fishing. For the past 4 months, he has worked on a detailed research project and has just met with failure in his verification of results. What is wrong? He's a qualified man, provided with the very finest working tools in laboratory equipment. He knows where the trouble lies because, in his own words, it happens every day. His most important laboratory tools, the animals he employs in research, are unreliable.
I suppose the first thing to answer is to throw back a question: who or what is an animal? When we think about lab animals, we're really thinking about a specific subset of the very contradictory relationships we have with all kinds of other animals. Lab animals are very specific in the sense that we expect them to kind of stand in for us, standing in as models for our physical illnesses or mental illnesses, and their animalness gets subordinated to that particular role. But they are also animals. They are rats or mice or chimpanzees or dogs or whatever, with all the species specificities that that entails. There was a very interesting study some years ago now by a sociologist of science, Michael Lynch, who was interviewing people who were doing neurophysiological experiments. They were using rats. And he noted an important distinction, which is between the naturalistic animal and the analytic animal. So when these scientists would talk about that was good data, what they meant was they'd got a good slide taken from the animal's brain after its death. Meaning, well, we've got a good slide here. We can actually see the nerve cells or whatever. Not that it was a well-behaved animal or whatever that might mean in its life. And in order to become a lab animal, it's got to make that transition from being a natural animal to being an analytic animal, to becoming data, to becoming a tool of the trade. And a great deal of scientific practice over the last century or so has been about making animals into data. Most people who are working with lab animals do actually recognise that they are animals, that they can bite and they need feeding and they need various things. But in terms of the overall practices of science, it is still animals that are bred in order to become part of the apparatuses of science.
Jag väntar på dig, 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 jag väntar på dig. När kommer du tillbaka till mig? När kommer du tillbaka till mig? När kommer du tillbaka till mig?
Yeah, I always wanted to be a vet, and then when I was an anthropology major, and I was on the science side of anthropology, so I did a lot of anatomy, and also I was trying to get a biology minor, I think, for a while, so I took a lot of genetics and chemistry and biology classes. And I don't know, at some point, I needed to work, and I had worked in some restaurants, and then I guess I just knew more and more professors, and there was a job in the animal labs.
In my medical training, like everyone else, I read the medical literature, and we came to understand, or think that we understood, that using various animals to address human diseases was essential, that there was no other way to do it. And I became interested in studying coronary artery disease. And as I finished my postgraduate cardiology training in Boston, I arranged to continue in the research vein on the basis of a 5-year grant that I received from the American Heart Association.
Well, for a number of years, I did research using non-human animals in ways that were harmful to them. I had been trained in the kind of classic Western medicine thinking that this was an appropriate way to resolve biological questions. And I was a principal investigator involving a number of projects. During that time, I started questioning what I was doing and whether it was not so much scientifically appropriate, but whether it was ethically appropriate. And I questioned my colleagues in the field and was surprised at the extreme defensiveness.
I found that some of the animal technicians were asking me to become a bit more involved in some of the work, for example, like picking up the dogs and taking them from the pens to the technicians who would then be force feeding these animals with capsules which they would force down their throats. So it got too difficult for me and I decided to leave, and it was very difficult to leave. I mean, in one sense, there was a great relief that I no longer had to go back to that place, but at the same time I felt guilty about leaving those animals behind. But I left, determined that I would actually make sure that I did reveal what was going on to them.
In 19th century physiology, people would use whatever species came to hand, and that might mean dogs, which perhaps were garnered from the street. It might mean grabbing frogs out of the local pond or whatever. And a great deal of physiology was done on a variety of different species. But over time, that narrowed down. And again, these are the animals, of course, which are supposed to stand for a generalization across all species, all vertebrates or all mammals. But in fact, historically, the diversity of species used in animal labs declined considerably. So that was the first stage. You're standardized in the sense of you're limiting the number of species. And then what you're getting is standardized laboratory animals as bred for particular kinds of traits over the next century. But it's not just a selection for behavioural and physiological traits. It also goes hand in hand with standardisation of laboratory practices. To take one example, in order to do interventions in the brain of a living animal, they require that the head will have to be trapped into a special apparatus, a stereotaxic apparatus. And there was a period in the history of mid-20th century neurophysiology, where they were trying to get animals, rats and mice particularly, that fit the apparatus. They, particularly large ones wouldn't fit the apparatus. So there's a standardization of equipment going on at the same time as there's a standardization of animals. There's also a standardization of spaces, in that I suppose at the end of the 19th century it was probably relatively commonplace to have animals perhaps in the next room or in the same room or whatever, or you'd go and get it from outside. Increasingly over the 20th century, and particularly since the Second World War, the separation of animal laboratory and animal house became more apparent, and perhaps that was at its most extreme with one of the labs that we were visiting in the course of our research study in the UK, because the scientists were telling us that the animal house was some miles away, and the scientists only dealt with tissues. So what they did was to telephone or fax the technicians who were working in the animal house and saying, we want such and such tissues today, and technicians would deal with the animal. They'd kill it and dissect it and remove the tissues, and then send the tissues by courier to the scientists. And the technicians would tell us, well, we do try and encourage the scientists to come down and see the real animals sometimes, but of course there is a massive separation here. It's even a geographical one between where the animals are actually living and the practices of the laboratory. So there's been a standardization in that sense of both animals and people and spaces over 100 or so years.
In the heart of Cambridgeshire, surrounded by miles of beautiful, low-lying countryside, lies a small village called Woolley. Driving from Woolley towards the A1, one cannot fail to notice what appears to be a large industrial complex snugly situated in a valley. At a distance, it resembles a large factory with its chimneys and assortment of buildings. A fairly innocuous-looking place, set back off the A1, surrounded by open fields. On approaching the site, you can see that it is totally surrounded by high wire fencing. There are also video cameras set back within the grounds. Those buildings that do have windows are often blanked out completely. As you drive nearer to the main gates of the site, you can see security guards. If you slow down in your car, do not be surprised when they step out of their office to watch you. You may even see them writing something down and talking into hand radios. Surely they are not taking down your car number. Again, you wonder what sort of establishment this could possibly be. Could it be something to do with the armed forces? There is nothing to suggest what might be taking place here behind all this security. The centre is well known in the area. Indeed, many locals have worked there or have family or friends employed at the complex. Those that haven't are well informed nevertheless. The centre's work has been a subject of heated local debate for years. Behind those brick walls and blanked out windows are thousands upon thousands of animals being forced to take part in toxicological research, something you could not possibly have known from simply driving past. But then you weren't supposed to.
On arrive le matin, puis on se change pour pas contaminer dans les pièces, comme nos vêtements de l'extérieur et toutes ces choses-là. On va rentrer le matin, on va faire ce qu'on appelle des signes cliniques. So on va évaluer le health status de l'animal, make sure that le théa qu'on donne, s'il n'y a pas des effets secondaires, comme on va évaluer feces, scabs, stuff like that. On écrit tout. So there's different studies there's different types of studies. You have IV studies, you have intramuscular studies, you have inhalation studies, you have, ça dépend de la voie d'administration que le médicament va être donné. So you have, obviously the inhalation studies for the monkeys are very hard because monkeys, when they're stressed, they tend to stop breathing. And having a mask in your face, sitting in a chair, don't know what's going on, getting stuff blown in your face. So souvent, on avait des singes qui faisaient des arrêts respiratoires. Puis là, c'est emergency, you have to revive the animal, tout ça. Fait que c'est beaucoup stressant pour nous, puis pour les singes aussi. Ça, c'est régulier. C'est à toutes les fois qu'on a une étude d'inhalation de singes, on assigne, dépendant combien de singes qui sont dosés en même temps, c'est un technicien pour 2 animaux, versus les chiens où ça va être 1 pour 4 animaux. Juste parce qu'il faut constant monitoring of the animal, parce que ça arrête comme ça. C'est 1 seconde, il respire, l'autre seconde, c'est that's it. C'est plus, je dirais, les études anti-cancer qui sont les plus dures sur les animaux, because you know what an anti-cancer is doing. C'est comme chemo on a person is hard. Fait que sur tous les tests, souvent c'est les animaux qui ont plus de side effects puis tout ça. Il y a aussi les études, ils appellent ça maximum tolerated dose. Ça, c'est des études où ils savent que le produit fonctionne, but they're not sure how high the concentration can be for it still to be safe. So they test until usually a fatality or a near fatality. They will start, like let's say on week 1, they'll start just with the vehicle. And then on week 2, they're going to give un petit dose. On week 3, they're going to, until they see what they want to see. It's hard to be in my position and say that it's all wrong or say that it's right, and because I see the repercussions that all of that has on the chimpanzees. And it's sad to say I'm only 23 and animal death doesn't do anything for me. Like I can, c'est comme quand Tom est décédé, c'était la première fois vraiment que j'ai pleuré parce qu'un animal est décédé, parce que j'ai pas pu rien faire pour l'aider. Tandis qu'en laboratoire, quand il y a des situations comme ça, il y a tout le temps un vétérinaire qui va venir, puis ils vont tout le temps ramener l'animal. C'est quand tu dis que tu es 6 mois tous les jours avec les mêmes animaux toute la journée, puis OK, c'est la journée nécropsie, mais OK, c'est correct. Puis je trouvais que c'était mieux que les animaux meurent, qu'ils restent là, parce que je me dis, dans le fond, c'est comme la liberté pour eux.
I mean, mostly my experience has been that people have never thought about it at all. You know, they don't have any preconceived notion because it's just never crossed their mind to think about. One thing that always I find very discouraging, you know, if there's an article on lab animals or especially primates in labs, and you know, I tend to read people's comments that they write into those kind of articles, or even comments that researchers make in those type of articles when they, you know, talk about, you know, we have the Animal Welfare Act, we do this research humanely, and, you know, we take really good care of our animals and we give them enrichment, and the Animal Welfare Act protects them and ensures that we do humane work and humane care. I think that's a huge misconception. I think the Animal Welfare Act provides really minimal standards and requirements for enrichment in particular. And, you know, to me, when you're looking at a monkey who may have been wild caught and is now living in a, you know, 2 foot by 2 foot by, you know, 2 foot stainless steel box in a cinder block room, you know, slapping a little forage board in front of them and giving them some sunflower seeds to pick at, I mean, that's all the law requires. And I mean, I don't see what's enriching about that, and I don't see anything humane about that. And I you know, it's still, I think it's a huge misconception to think that, well, we have laws in place. Well, we always treat them humanely because the law protects them. I think that's a huge fallacy. I thought the building was really beautiful, the Med Sciences building in particular. It was this, you know, really old stone building, and it was this kind of beautiful, haunting sort of place. You know, I was often completely alone there with all the animals, and that's me in the lab 20 years ago plus. I'm in one of the bird rooms. I can't tell what kind of birds are in those cages, but there's birds all around me. It's me and my scrubs. This seems to be a photo of the catbird room. This would have been one of the catbirds I worked with. Catbirds are not very personable, so I had no relationships with any of them. At Yerkes, well, for one, I think the stakes were higher at Yerkes. You know, I think I had some sense that taking photos will get me fired, you know, so there was that, because it was before we had little tiny cameras that fit in your pocket. So, you know, I think part of it was was that. But I think a lot more of it at Yerkes was I didn't want to document it. I in some ways it's like I was there yesterday, the amount of detail I recall and the faces I can still picture, but I just, and especially I thought about taking photos of Jerome, and I just couldn't do it. I didn't want to capture him. I didn't want to remember. I didn't want to, someday flip back through my old pictures of all those good times, the good times I never had in the lab, and the good times they never ever had their whole lives in the lab.
Rodents are the animal of choice for a great many experiments. They're purpose-bred to become a huge variety of animal models for human illnesses. But part of the reason that they become acceptable is because in the rest of our culture they are seen as vermin. And we have a long history of very close association. They're one of the most commensal species with us. They live very closely to us. It's been said that you're never more than 5 meters away from a rat, which is sometimes a scary thought when you think about them living in the sewers and so on. And it's partly because of that, for example, the British Home Office, who oversee all experimentation in the UK, they produce an annual report which says about what experiments have been done and in broad brush terms. But one of the lines in this is always 85 or so % of experiments in the last year were done on rats and mice, because that's where public opinion is much more likely to be swayed. And if you do, there have been a number of surveys of public opinion, and most people will say that they'll accept various procedures in scientific experiments to be done on rodents, which they would not accept on dogs or primates. People draw the line differently. It's much more acceptable.
All right, it's party time, peepers. We're just checking out now to make sure our little caption or text works. Asked Peepers which one she wanted, and she picked party time. She says everything's a party to her. I was in first year university, and a girl on my floor was taking a class, as was I, called Fundamentals of Nutrition, which is still offered at the University of Guelph. And for 12 weeks, they are given a baby rat, and they have to feed it a certain food and record how many miles it runs on an exercise wheel. So these rats are called Wistar rats, which just refers to the lab that they're bred at. And they come from the States, and they're bred for endurance and exercise. When her 12-week experiment was done, they recorded their findings. Unfortunately, if you don't take your rat, they euthanize them. So her being very allergic and also not wanting a pet rat, I ended up taking her and snuck her into my residence, and she lived the rest of the year there with me, sort of illegally.
I was appointed to the campus-wide Animal Use Committee, and what we did was look at every protocol that used non-human animals and make a determination whether the protocol could be improved with respect to welfare issues and whether the protocol should be allowed. I viewed my position on the committee as being an advocate for the animals. I don't believe that there was another person on the committee who had the views that I had, and this was demonstrated by how they voted. But I also recognized that I couldn't simply blanket vote no, because if I did that, then nobody would listen to me. They would just say, well, Ned always votes no, so what's the point? You know, he doesn't make anything different based on the quality or aspects of the research project or teaching. So I was very careful about when I voted no. I tried to reserve my no vote for those situations which I thought were particularly egregious. To give you an example, there was an experiment where mosquitoes were being studied, but a mammal was being used, a mouse, to feed these mosquitoes every day. And this mouse, or a mouse I should say, because I imagine it was different mice at different times, would be put into a small tube with lots of holes in the tube. He or she would be suspended by a string above the mosquitoes, within the mosquito cage. The mouse could not turn around, could not scratch, could not in any way defend herself or himself, and was going to be allowed to feed the mosquitoes all night long. I objected strenuously to this. I thought this was one of the most inhumane things that they were trying to do on the campus. And I pleaded with my fellow committee members to not allow this at all, because there were alternatives. In fact, at our sister or sibling institution at Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, a researcher was doing similar studies with mosquitoes, but was feeding them blood from student volunteers and paid the students to do this. Quite acceptable from a scientific and ethical perspective. I think I got a few of my committee members to vote no, but ultimately the majority voted yes, but with a reduced exposure time down to 2 hours, which to me made no sense. I mean, 2 hours to the mouse was a lifetime.
She was just 14 weeks old, and she was just so cute, and she was so scared. And what a difference from, I mean, these clips where she's confident and running around and doing her stuff. She was very, very scared. She didn't want to be handled. She was sort of afraid of people. And again, within a week, this like little personality came out. She would hang out on my shoulder. She crawled in my sleeve. She used to sleep in my sleeve while I was studying. She'd crawl up my arm and just hang out in between the space between my elbow and my long sleeve shirt. I remember sometimes my arm would get tired and I would want to have to put it down, but I didn't want to disturb her. Her thing was she would bring one blanket into her igloo. I used to put the igloo on top, and she would pull the blanket in and then stuff it so that Gabby couldn't get in. And then she would just sleep in there. She loved it. But if he tried to come in, there'd be like a screaming war. They shriek. She was a drama queen. They have this course and these labs every semester, every year. So really, it's nothing that a student can read in a book and say, yes, if you feed them this, it enhances exercise or performance by this. It's not like we're talking about groundbreaking, life-saving research here. This is a third-year university course with a basic nutrition premise. And again, they use a chicken in the next semester as well. And that poor chicken, luckily Jessica also found a home for her chicken, but most people weren't able to take them or weren't able to find them a home. And most people wouldn't necessarily care, because when you sign up for the course, you're just trying to learn your basic nutrition principles, and you don't think you're going to have to be finding a home for an animal. It's sort of, if you want the animal, you can take it. If not, it's going to be euthanized.
I graduated in 2002, and I went into the research industry, and it was really interesting. It was pretty much the foundation of all my research stemmed there. I learned a lot of basic research techniques used in the laboratory, and towards the second year I was in the field, we entered more into animal testing. In particular, we were using mice, and in order to work with mice in general, we had to go through a lot of training. I remember we learned handling techniques, ways to collect blood, like retroorbital bleeds, terminal cardiac puncture, how to identify mice. So we worked on tagging mice, tagging their ears, and how to kill mice using CO2. I didn't like any of it, but I just accepted it at the time as something that had to be done. I remember just putting lots of mice in the CO2 chamber and just turning the CO2 up and watching them asphyxiate. And I mean, it's a tough thing to see. You're destroying a life. And it was horrible. It really was horrible. And that's when that's the first time I asked one of the lead researchers who I was helping out at the time. I asked him, how do you deal with this? This is a horrible thing to see and do. How do you deal with this? And I remember he said, you have to see that you're doing something good, that you're doing this for the greater good of science and advancement and research. And it was tough for me to buy into, but I tried to convince myself that was the case, that this was all necessary. It weighs heavy on me, and I just didn't know what it was for. I just didn't see the meaning of having to do this to an animal.
Some people would argue, 12 weeks in the lab, that's not that bad. Well, A, there's no one saying that the student's going to be able to adopt it or take it, and B, that is actually a significant portion of that animal's life, where it isn't in contact with other rats. They weren't allowed to be housed together. Each one was in its separate cage with a different food, with a different wheel, with a different terms for that experiment. The only human contact they were allowed was for recording the measurements. There was no social time, no playtime. There was no external sort of stimuli. And these animals basically were just mere subjects of reading a number off a wheel, information that we've already produced and isn't going to further us anymore, especially not in terms of nutrition. I think I was surprised myself that, the first day I was taking this rat going, what am I doing taking a rat? I was so touched by how much these little critters actually worked their way into my heart. I mean, they're so affectionate, they're so social. If you've had a pet growing up, they, just like individuals, they have certain tendencies or little characteristics or traits or things that they like to do. Again, you really learn that these are actual lives. They feel pain, they have personalities, they have favorite foods. There was even certain music that they responded to when I would play in my room more than others. And I think me just learning this unintentionally, I wasn't planning on, having this sort of experience, made me sort of a rat advocate. I perpetually then would go to school and get so frustrated that every day there's thousands of them who didn't have a home, didn't have contact from either a human or other animal, didn't get to see sunlight, didn't get to experience sleeping in a hammock or a bed, didn't get fresh foods, didn't get fresh fruits and vegetables, and get to experience all the things that we enjoy.
Every one of our facilities is regularly inspected for regulatory compliance, and each of them has accreditation for animal welfare standards from the American Association for the Advancement of Laboratory Animal Care. We take the care of our animals very seriously, and our high ethical standards are core to our corporate philosophy.
Producers of particular strains of lab animals have to try to sell them. That's what their job is, isn't it? So sell the product, and it's called a product. So they are in the business of trying to breed animals for particular traits. And so then they say that, you know, these are well-produced animals, it's a good product, there's not much variability, you can rely on us. But these are, in a certain way, those are the kind of tropes of advertising generally, aren't they? That, you know, we produce a good product. So the other side of advertising is to say that this will help research, these animals will help research. And there's a difference here. This is where we're talking about something different from other products, where this will help your research, which could mean a bit of apparatus for number crunching. These animals will help your research. And what's interesting here is that sometimes you will get a depiction of the animal that makes it much more of a naturalistic animal again. This might be done by a cartoon pose so that it's wearing human clothes. So it's kind of quasi-animal, quasi-person, but it's certainly represented as though it's some sort of living, sentient creature. It's not just a thing at this point. You're not going to see so much of the numbers. You actually might see a representation of the animal as a photograph, or you might see a line drawing of an animal, but it is very clearly an animal at this point, and it's being made back into a naturalistic animal in order to sell its particular characteristics.
I remained in rodent toxicology until July. At my request, I had asked for a transfer to the dog toxicology unit to embark on the next stage in the investigation. Despite being pleased that I had been granted the transfer, I knew that after having already spent 5 months at HRC, I now had to find new reserves of emotional and physical energy to get me through the next few months. Once again, I found myself peering into rooms full of beagles. The last time I had done so was during my interview in January. Now, almost 6 months later, I was ready to record and photograph day-to-day life within the dog toxicology unit. There were 3 dog units altogether with the capacity to house up to 1,500 beagles at any one time. HRC proudly claimed that this is the largest dog laboratory facility in Europe. Units J06 and D12 were the 2 experimental buildings, containing 20 and 10 rooms respectively. I was told by another member of staff that the beagles were bred locally in Huntingdon at an establishment called Interfauna. Interfauna was founded by 2 ex-HRC employees and breeds a variety of animal species for research.
I was studying the usefulness of radio-labeled imaging agents to study the coronary artery disease and hopefully to detect blockages in the coronary arteries using radioactive tracers and special cameras. The animals that I used were dogs. I did not have in my mind at the time where those dogs were obtained. I assumed they were purchased from dealers, but they could have been pound seizure animals for all I knew at the time. The dogs were anesthetized and the tracers were injected intravenously, and we did imaging to detect where the radio tracers were going in the heart. Then, in order to understand the distribution of the radio tracer into the coronary arteries and into the heart muscle, we took the dogs off the gantries. We took them in the operating suite and we opened their chests, removed their hearts, and then sliced the heart into sections so that we could study them grossly and under the microscope.
The life of a beagle at HRC comprised being shut in a barren, unfriendly cell with no bedding or play objects. They were allowed just half a spadeful of sawdust to aid the cleaning out process, and a food and water bowl. It was a terrible way for a highly sociable pack animal to have to spend his or her life. On top of these conditions, the beagles then had to endure the pain and suffering associated with the daily toxicity tests. I watched as these tiny bundles of pent-up energy threw themselves around their small, bare cells, bored and frustrated. On opening the cage door, they would tumble out and hurl themselves up and down the room. As one beagle was released, others would catch sight of him or her darting around and start barking excitedly, waiting for their turn. After just a couple of minutes of frantic activity, they would struggle in my arms as I picked them up to return them to their cages. Once back in, they would throw themselves at the cage door as I closed it behind them. After having worked in the unit for just a short while, I soon discovered that this excitable behaviour shown by the puppies, the darting around and refusing to return to their cages, does not last long in most of the dogs. In just a few weeks, those who still ventured out of their cages, and many would not, would meekly return, offering no resistance, their spirit broken.
If you subscribe to the notion that that kind of research is essential to advance human medicine, and your career and your life revolve around advancing human medicine, then you come to see it as a necessary evil. It wasn't till I was doing it that I realized that wasn't true, but that's how you view it. I had dogs who lived with me at the time. I love dogs. The way I always put it was, if anyone tried to harm my dogs, I'm afraid I might kill them. Which sounds extreme, but that's how your mind works when your dogs are your children. And yet here I was, getting in my car every day, going to the cardiology department, to my lab, and killing dogs. When you compartmentalize it, you can keep cognitive dissonance at arm's length. You can defend your psyche by understanding that your dogs are your family and this is your work, and your work is focused on saving lives. There came a time when I started to realize that what I was doing with dogs in the laboratory wasn't quite what I thought it was in terms of contributing to human health, and that began to dovetail with the dissonance aspect of it. I was losing the battle with cognitive dissonance. And I finally had to realize that the only difference between my dogs and these dogs was that my dogs got lucky. That's not a basis for using an animal for experiments and killing the animals. One got lucky, one didn't.
cuando la cogimos era una perra muy miedosa, tenía muchas fobias, o sea, simplemente el hecho de bajar unas escaleras no lo entendía, y de hecho pues hasta tuvimos que estar ahí bajando escaleras para que ella pudiera asimilar que no pasaba nada, que no era nada agresivo para ella. Simplemente el hecho de bajar a la calle para ella era algo aterrador, pero a la vez que aterrador también tenía muchas ganas de probar cosas nuevas, de curiosear, ¿no? Entonces los olores, la vista, ¿no? Todas las cosas, ya era como descubrirlo todo por primera vez, o sea, como una segunda vida. Si lo explicase, claro, desde una perspectiva de un perro, yo creo que ya describiría su anterior vida como algo de privación, ¿no? De privación de libertad, de privación de emociones, también incluso de sentidos, ¿no? Porque pues eso, pues se veía como que tenía miedo pues a cualquier sonidos extraños, pues eso, serían todos siempre sonidos muy tenues, sería todo muy gris, ¿no? La oscuridad, el miedo a saber qué es lo que te va a ocurrir, viendo que tus compañeros están también en las jaulas, entonces sería una vida como de secuestrado, ¿no? Como si te hubieras secuestrado desde tu nacimiento y no hubieras conocido otra cosa que una cárcel. Entonces yo creo que es algo muy duro, y supongo que ya lo describiría así, ¿no? Como una vida llena de privaciones, una vida pues de esclavo, ¿no? De recluso, de un perro que ha estado encarcelado.
So I made the very difficult determination to stop doing experiments on dogs or any other animals, and took that decision to my supervisor, and that conversation was not pleasant and resulted in me leaving that program. Fortunately, I was able to take my grant with me by rewriting a new grant based on imaging studies in patients, human patients. So I was able to continue my career, but that my academic career as a research cardiologist was up in smoke. And interestingly, that as I left his office with that knowledge, it was okay with me because it had just fallen off my shoulders. I didn't have to fight that battle anymore, trying to justify what I was doing on the basis of what my beliefs were regarding animals.
Ella, en todo este año, lo que realmente ha cambiado, que ha sido mucho, ha sido a superar todos sus miedos. Ha sido a ver que la vida es completamente distinta a lo que le ofrecían al principio y que la va a poder disfrutar, que va a poder oler las cosas, que va a poder relacionarse con otros perros, con otros humanos, con otros animales. Ella ahora pues es completamente, o sea, yo la veo pues feliz, cuando recibe una visita se pone feliz. Es una perra que tiene muy poquitos miedos, que enseguida pues, le gusta inspeccionar las cosas, buscar tu cariño, ha cambiado mucho. Para mí es ponerle a esos seres que pues en vídeos o ves en fotos o ves cuando lees cosas, ponerle una cara, ¿no? Un nombre, una persona que hay detrás, que sufre, ¿no? Viendo que es un ser que quiere tener libertad, que quiere vivir plenamente y, claro, lógicamente para mí refuerza, aún más si cabe, mi rechazo a todo tipo de explotación animal.
I was deeply saddened to see that cages that had previously contained beagles were now empty. All that remained to show that the beagles had been there were food bowls and their experimental cards left hanging on the cage doors. The 30 days of life that this group of beagles had been allowed by HRC had now run out. Although the forlorn little beagle with a dejected look, who had affected me so, was still in her cage, I knew that she too would soon be dead. In just a short while the room would be completely empty, the brief lives of these gentle animals would have come to an end. As I walked out of the room, I was overcome with sadness and a terrible sense of loss at the death of these beagles. The whole day had become a nightmare, and I decided then and there I could take no more. I therefore walked through the gates of HRC for the final time on that Saturday the 16th of September 1989, overwhelmed by the grief and anger that had built up inside me for the past 8 months. But with a solemn promise to the animals... Okay. But with a solemn promise to the animals I walked away from, that their suffering would remain a secret no longer.
Most people give a lot of thought to ethical dilemmas, but they locate the centre of the ethics in a completely different place. So while they'll acknowledge that there are a lot of ethical issues about using animals, they feel that it's morally justified because not trying to deal with horrendous diseases is ethically objectionable. That for many of them who are using animals to say, let's take one of the more emotive examples, to work on problems of childhood leukemia, you have to use animals as a model because for them that is a less bad thing to do than not to try and solve childhood leukemia. Obviously, for anti-vivisectionists, the problem of ethics centres on the animals, and no use of animals is ever justified. But ethics is at the centre of both sets of decision-making. It has a completely different focus. Now, I know, of course, that there are scientists who use chimpanzees, but there are also another whole load of scientists who will say, well, you know what, I'm quite happy to do these things on rodents, but I'm not sure that I'd really like to do some of the more invasive techniques on primates. They often personally would draw their species line there. Or they might tell us that there are some techniques that they wouldn't like to do. And I think that's true of quite a lot of the scientists of my acquaintance. They'll draw the line somewhere. Or there was another scientist we interviewed who said, I see the white mice as individuals. I know a lot of people don't, but I do. I could do these things to a goldfish, but I couldn't do them to a mouse. So there are ways of working within science. You have to become used to it. You have to become part of it. And you will learn to justify that, if you didn't already, with respect to a completely different set of ethics.
Thì phải là tiện tay là gì? Chẳng có rồi. Chẳng có chút hạt lại. No. Đó. Ủa hạt lăn. Ơi.
In 2004, we got a phone call from Queen's University asking us if we could take a monkey named Darla. And Darla, from the day she moved in, broke our hearts. There was just something about her and her personality and the look she had in her eyes that was extremely painful to look at and, be around. It was just really difficult. She was about 17 years old at the time. She had been in a group with some other friends, and unfortunately her friends were still in a study and they couldn't come, so she was sent on her own. I wasn't happy about that, but it was the circumstance and that was it. Darla clearly had been in 2 different studies or different facilities or something like that because she has 2 tattoo numbers. And normally in a lot of situations that indicated that they'd move from one facility to the next. So that sort of indicated that she probably had quite a life of research, at 17 years old.
She'd probably been through quite a bit. We didn't receive any medical files. They seemed to be really nervous about talking about the kinds of research that they were doing there. Months later, when the woman who worked with Darla came for a visit, one of the things she did tell us was that she had been in menstrual studies and her uterus had been removed. So, of course, that was, distressing to know that she'd been involved in that kind of thing. And then what really seemed to affect the woman was when she began to talk about the next study that Darla was involved with, and it was involving anorexia. Now, very vague, not any information, except that she started to cry during that conversation and how she said she couldn't deal with watching it any longer. She did indicate that that was the time where Darla got into a lot of fights over food, which would make sense. So that's when she lost her tail, and that's when the damage was done. There's scars all over her body. Her piece of her ear is gone, and other things. When Darla first moved in, she had this habit of putting her arms or hands up over her eyes, sometimes both hands covering her eyes at the same time with her arms straight up over her eyes. It's pretty clear what it is. She was trying to hide or protect herself or not see what was going on around her. It was her self-defense. That was really awful to see. It was really painful to watch her do that, especially when you were just going to provide enrichment or do something really, something special. But the clutching items, like whatever items might be in the enclosure, I find really painful to watch too, because that to me sort of indicates the need to hug something, need to hold something. It's usually something that's not very soft. It's a hard object. It might have been a child, that instinct to hold your baby. There's so many things about watching that are really brutally painful to witness. It's difficult for her when she witnesses deaths in the monkey house. That sets her back. That's really traumatic for her. And that's part of the reason why, you see how the lab life just never leaves them. The sad part, over the years, lots of sanctuaries have been approached to take individual monkeys from different laboratories, always secretly, always never knowing anything about the studies they've been involved in, never knowing anything about their past, never knowing about their preferences or their fears or their, what they enjoyed in their life or who they had in their lives, what friends they had. They're hardly ever reunited with old friends, and they have memories. They certainly would remember old friends. It's almost as though once the university does something like that and their monkeys arrive in some sanctuary, they make sure that it'll never happen again. They make sure that a termination program is put in place. They don't want the employees to try or hope or get anybody out. So, that's kind of the sad reality of that kind of thing. We recently had the opportunity to possibly rescue 2 monkeys, 2 rhesus macaques, 2 girls that could have joined Darla. Unfortunately, the laboratory wasn't willing to, do what we needed to do that. So they were terminated. What do you say about that? That's what happens. Termination.
Research into the unknown is possible through animal experiments. Because the primate is the closest physiologically to man, their use in aeromedical research is far superior to all other animals.
It goes back to the early years of the scientific revolution when scientists believed that what was important to science was that it was going to be witnessed. It wasn't just that you did an experiment and happened to write up about it in your living room. You had to get somebody else to see it. And so one way of it becoming public, what you did, is that you write up the methods. Now, this does mean that it's supposed to be replicable. In practice, of course, it isn't, and especially around animals. Under precisely controlled conditions, the animal does what it damn well pleases. You can't control exactly what animals do and how they behave and so on. But also part of the reason that animals can be unpredictable has to do with the fact that even though they're pretty separated from people in laboratories and they're put in these tiny cages and so on, sometimes individually, they do have some contact with people some of the time. And there is a certain amount of evidence now that how animals are handled matters a great deal in terms of the predictability or reproducibility of the results. The notion that by giving the methods in detail, that the experiment is therefore replicable, leaves out something which we now call tacit knowledge. There's a great deal of knowledge about how to work particular bits of apparatus, how to handle animals, which doesn't get written down. Of course, it's handed down from teacher to student through the generations, but it doesn't actually get written down on the whole. So the desire to control everything, which is fundamental to how science operates and is very necessary in many ways, can also lead to a kind of multiplying of other effects which are much more difficult to control. And it's an illusion to think that we can control everything and that we can replicate everything, because it appears that we can't.
I don't have any photos from Yerkes. I'm sure I had ample opportunity to take photos, but I couldn't do it. I didn't want to capture them on film. I didn't want to look back 20 years later and look at Jerome's face. So there's a little part of me that, because I've been interviewed so many times, and I've wished so many times I could just give somebody a photo of him in particular. And then I just think that then I would have a photo of him. So I met Jerome before I started working with him. They treated the AIDS project differently. The people who worked with the HIV/SIV monkeys also worked with the HIV chimps. They were all captive born here at Yerkes, as far as I understand. Most of them had been infected when they were a lot younger. They were infected in different ways. They had studied the routes of transmission, so some of them were infected vaginally, and some were, I guess, given transfusions, and Jerome was given, I think, 3 different strains of virus. The chimp model wasn't working, so the idea had been, in the mid-'80s, that we were going to need chimps for AIDS research. We just started learning about AIDS in the early 80s, and we needed an animal model, and so they started infecting chimps, in the late 80s, and they just didn't get sick. Nothing happened, and they infected them all these different ways, and nothing happened, and so they stuck them up in that building in CID, and they left them there. The whole building had just been kind of sitting there for years. They would get hosed down once or twice a day. People would come in and throw chow and give them oranges and then leave, and that was it. And I vividly recall going in there the first time, and I had to suit up, which is always an ordeal, and it's floor-to-ceiling chimps, and they didn't know me, and they still weren't really used to people around all the time, and all of them started displaying, and I just remember them throwing themselves at the cages at us, and shit flying everywhere, and it was very, very overwhelming, and I think their lives were really boring and really bleak. For a very long time, those of us who were working up there, we had started doing enrichment because it was new and fresh and we were supposed to, and so we started, giving them new fruits and vegetables and giving them substrates to play with, and I remember at one point this was a pain in the ass, but we gave them straw once. We gave them straw bales, and that was fun, but it was really, really messy and really hard to clean up, and nobody wanted to think that he might be getting sick from the HIV, and they tried to blame the new fruits and vegetables, or no, it's the straw, or no, it's this and that, and it's the corn this time, but he was wasting, and those of us who knew people with AIDS, we knew this was for real, and so they started separating him from his group because he started getting really weak, and that's when I really started working with him in earnest. have mixed feelings about this now, but we nursed him back to life. I mean, I think we saved his life so that he could die a few months later. I mean, it was a friend of mine at Chimp Haven put up a question yesterday or a couple of days ago, and she said that somebody had recently asked her if she had ever seen a chimp cry, and I wrote in and I said I have. When I first started being around him, I mean, he was skeletal, just a skeleton, and then when he'd gotten separated from his group and we knew we started talking about AIDS, he couldn't hold his head up anymore, and he would sit on the floor and he would prop his head on his hand, and if he wanted to look at something, he would have to turn his head with his hand, and he would cry. I saw him cry and just curl up on the floor in front of me in a fetal position, and he just, I've actually said to people before, the only difference to me between the humans I worked with who had AIDS and Jerome was that he didn't know what was going on. There was no way to explain to him. And because he wasn't on a funded study and nobody really knew what was going on, nobody was able to treat him. And the sicker he got, the less other people wanted to go up there and be around him, because he just got to a point where he was so needy and just so miserable, and so I was the one, I guess. I think a lot of it was, I think I had a sense of what he was going through, just because I'd seen humans go into that state. He really didn't like people. I mean, I hate to anthropomorphize, but he was a teenage boy. I mean, he really, he did not want some older, woman around him. He didn't want humans around him. I feel like he kept me around because he needed somebody, and I was really the only one regularly there. I mean, there were other people who cared about him, but, when he was separated from his group, I had the sense that he knew he needed somebody to be on his side, and I tried to be very clear with him that I'm here for you, and I'll do whatever I can for you, but I also have all these other folks I have to take care of, but no matter what you do to me or how mad you get at me, I'll still be here, so you do what you have to do. I tried to stay very involved with the researchers, so I knew what the plan was, and they wanted to be able to say they had the first chimp with AIDS, and so I don't really remember who made the decision that when he got an AIDS-defining illness, they would euthanize him. Brent brought this stretcher up and he covered it with a sheet and made like a pillow on it, which I almost found just revolting. Even at the time, and looking back, I still what a disconnect, Here I am, I've been told for 2 years, don't care. Don't care. You cannot care. We're here for science. Then all of a sudden it's acknowledged that I love this chimp and I'm upset, and let's do this funny ceremony where we put him on a stretcher with a sheet on it and a pillow. We're going to kill him in like half an hour, and I don't know, it was very strange. So Brent and Denise put him on the stretcher and covered him up like he was sleeping, and I kissed him goodbye, and that was it. I knew for a long time before I left that I couldn't support the research anymore. I just knew the whole time I was with Jerome, I knew I had to document what was happening to him, and I knew that I had to leave and tell his story, and it's not really in my nature to do things like that, and I felt very obligated. I felt like I took this blood money to work in this place, and I did these things that I had to as part of my job, and not, so I didn't get fired, but, in payment, I guess, or payback or whatever, I had to talk. And so when I left, I was told after that what we learned from Jerome was that HIV causes AIDS. I'm not sure how taking the life of a 14-year-old chimp and subjecting dozens of other chimps to that kind of life is any sort of justification for anything, frankly. I mean, I don't know why anybody would think that that's necessary. I mean, Frank Novembre got some publications out of Jerome, and Nathan actually was infected with Jerome's blood, and Nathan's also dead now. I don't know what was necessary about any of that, and I don't know what to say. I mean, to me, there's no moral justification for treating sentient beings in that manner.
This is history. This isn't... I mean, there's so many thousands of them that are gone. You know, they were used in some study, they were used up, and they were euthanized, and we'll never know who they were, or, you know, their stories will never be out there, even though each of their stories was really different from their cage mates' stories.
His most important laboratory tools, the animals he employs in research, are unreliable.
When we plan studies, no one ever says, you know, let's be really careful about this study. Let's exhaust all the possibilities we have on the bench first. No one ever really talks about that. It's, okay, what can we do next? What can we put into these animals? What can we do to further our data, to meet our deadlines? So it's been tough on me in that sense, but I mean, the real victims are, of course, the animals.
What is wrong? He's a qualified man, provided with the very finest working tools in laboratory equipment.
I hope I've done some good with the work that I've done. There's just no way of knowing until the end, whatever that is. What I'm doing is being done for what I hope are the best of reasons, which is to try to help these individuals who, through no fault of their own, have been ripped away from their homes, their families, placed in virtual prisons, subjected to procedures that you wouldn't wish on your enemy, let alone somebody who's innocent of everything.
This man knows, through bitter experience, that the quality of results of his entire project is directly related to the quality of the laboratory animals with which he is supplied.
I am happy that I can't compartmentalize it and I can't detach myself from it emotionally, because I think that's the kind of attitude all scientists should have. You know, I was fortunate enough to find that I'm not alone, that there are other people out there that have experienced a similar feeling that I have, that they see it as, you know, fundamentally wrong.
We've got a little of everything here. It's a Noah's Ark. Rabbits, guinea pigs, rats, mice, and numerous other animals.
If your heart tells you what you want to do, if you don't think you need to use animals in this way, or you don't want to do it because it violates your personal ethics, don't do it. Speak up. That's no longer a deal breaker. It's not going to get you kicked out of medical school. It's not going to get you thrown out of your biology class in high school.
Somewhere along the line, this animal became diseased or suffered malnutrition, or perhaps it was genetically impure or housed in a substandard environment.
To the animals, you know, I feel horrible. I mean, I can only say that I'm sorry, and I will advocate for change and, you know, push hard to really change this industry.
This man can now get back to work. He knows that the animals that he has just received are healthy and uniform. He knows that his laboratory tools are now all to standard.
When we come out and tell the stories from the animal's perspective, it's undeniable. You can't argue with the fundamental nature of research. When people like me are coming out and telling you, I knew these apes, I knew these monkeys, I can tell you their names, I can still smell the smells of the lab, and it was very real, it's still very real, and it's still going on, and it's not going to stop until something changes. And I just know that it's nice to have advocates on one side and we have the research on the other side, but, you know, the folks caught in the middle are the animals, and so it's up to us to come out and talk about them.
Jag väntar på dig, 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 jag väntar på dig. När kommer du tillbaka till mig? När kommer du tillbaka till mig? När kommer du tillbaka till mig? Jag väntar på dig, 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 till mig.